What's up, everybody? Floopy here, and we're going to talk about the best gameplay settings or league settings for your franchise mode. And I'm going to kind of talk about each one and exactly what all they mean, and maybe give you some tips, some tricks, some pointers on exactly which one you need to use and how to use it so that you have the best Madden experience possible. So first, we're going to talk about skill level. Skill level is obviously a difficulty at which the game is being played, and there's 4 different types. You got rookie, pro, all pro, and all Madden. Obviously, rookie is going to be the easiest, and all Madden is definitely the hardest. I have always played on all Madden, and this year all Madden is super cheesy. All Madden has always been kind of cheesy, with it being the hardest difficulty. The AI kind of quote unquote cheats, and you have to make a good slider set to make it realistic, but still keep the difficulty at a point where it's still better than all pro. I do have a good slider set. You can check the links down in the description for all Madden, but I am going to be switching over to all pro because I feel like it gives a more realistic, authentic NFL experience. And if that's something you're interested in, make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss it when I post that video. You can also join the Discord so that when I do make minute changes and stuff to my sliders, you will be updated on those because I won't always make a video for every change. All pro is probably, in my opinion, the best all-around setting for skill level this year. All pro is where head-to-head and mutts played in, and like I said, all Madden's just too brutal. If you want to see it, just watch some of my Bears franchise playthroughs. It's pretty bad. Now, the game style will kind of change also the way this game's being played. Now, I have a video breaking down simulation, competitive, and arcade, but of course we can go through these right quick, and if you're interested, make sure to watch that video. But simulation is going to give you quote-unquote the most authentic NFL experience. Competitive is what head-to-head mud is played on. You'll have kind of a mixture between simulation and arcade. And then arcade is going to give you, there's going to be a lot of big plays, over-the-top plays, a lot of big animations, wide receivers high pointing the ball, people breaking tackles, that type of thing. So if you mix arcade and simulation, you kind of get the competitive mode. So some people like competitive because it's what they're used to playing with on MUT and head-to-head. My personal opinion, I think simulation's the best, but again, it just goes down to user preference. Your league type you can change just depending on if you're doing like an online league, and you can determine what type of role each person in the league can do. So you can be only coaches, you can do coaches and owners, or you can do all, right? So it just, again, user preference, nothing big there. Instant starter will determine if you are going to be a starter, if you're just going to control a player at that position. So the league type, like I said, you've got coaches, you can do coaches and owners, and by all, it also includes players. So you can just play as a player, which is kind of the create a player mode or career mode that Madden now has. And if you want to instantly start, you can turn this on. If you don't want to instantly start, maybe you're like a rookie quarterback or something, then you can turn it off and try to work your way up into that role. Trade deadline, you can also obviously turn this on or off if you want trades to stop after week 8. After week 8 in the NFL, you can no longer trade. You have to wait to the off season or the start of the regular season of the following year to make trades. If you turn it off, you can trade at any time. Trade type will determine what type of trades can actually be performed. Now, this is more of just a if you're playing online with a bunch of different players, but you can change it. Now, Madden this year, there's been some pretty crazy trades. I've seen some pretty crazy trades in my Bears franchise. So maybe you want to disable this. Maybe until Madden fixes that issue, because there have been some ridiculous ones. You can disable it so that no trades happen whatsoever, or you can just change it to enable human so that you're the only one that can do a trade and the CPU cannot do it. Or again, you could just enable it all, which is the default. Coach firing is also another interesting thing. If you want to make your franchise playthrough just a little bit harder and tougher, you can have where the coaching firing is only on the CPU. But if you do turn this on and your role as a league type is set to coach, if you have a bad season, you can get fired. So you won't be on that team anymore. You'll have to look for a job elsewhere. Now, you can just have this where it's CPU only, and the CPU's teams will only fire their coaches, like I said, or you can completely turn it off so that every coach in the NFL will keep their job forever. Again, just user choice. I think on is the best in this situation. Salary cap, pretty self-sustainable. Salary cap, pretty self-explanatory. You can keep it on or off. If you ever get into financial trouble, and I've done this when I was playing, when I first got started in playing franchise mode, and I made a lot of bad moves early on, and then when I got in like year 4, 5, 6, 7, I didn't have any money to sign anyone. If you ever get into that situation, you could come over here, turn it off, and then turn it back on, or I think once you turn it off, it'll stay off, and then you can spend infinite amount of money Maybe you just want to be able to do whatever in your fantasy franchise world that you're creating, and keeping it off would make that kind of fun. Now, superstar abilities are obviously self-explanatory as well. You can turn those on or off. Now, I think they should be turned off if you are going to play CPU versus CPU, especially with all of the interceptions that are happening this year in Madden 23. I think if you're just going to watch the games in like coach mode, or if you're just watching it from CPU versus CPU standpoint, turn those off so that some of those DBs, secondary linebackers that have superstar traits that help them out in zone coverage and help them out with momentum and stuff like that, it won't come into effect and help limit some of those interceptions. The downside of that is that you don't get to see them be like a step above everyone else. But then again, rating should matter, and it's just kind of a trade-off. Ability edit controls will determine if you can edit any type of player. If you have it on any player, you can go to any team, go to the roster, and you can edit them however you would like. If it's none, then you can't edit any type of player. And if it's the commissioner only, that means if you are the commissioner of that league and you're in there with a bunch of friends, then they're the only ones that can do it. Now, this is good from time to time. Maybe if you want to go in and change, if some player in the NFL has had a huge signing bonus like Russell Wilson just did, you can go in there, edit it, change the salary of that player so that it replicates what's in real life, so you don't have to worry about it changing later on down the road. I personally like to do any player, but again, it's more of an honor system. You got to make sure you don't go in there and make your players better. Relocation settings is normally set to normal, and I like to turn mine off. Teams in the NFL don't relocate that much. We have seen it in years past with the LA Rams, the Chargers. We've seen the Raiders do it. So overall, I just don't like it being in Madden, because it seems like that a lot of teams will just randomly relocate, and it might be a team that has really good attendance, or might be a very prominent team in the NFL, and they just decide to relocate because the AI in Madden is, or the logic is really not that great. I personally don't like it. You can disable it, but if you are going in with the intentions of relocating a team at some point, of course you want to keep that on. You can change it to where everyone can relocate, only the user, or you can have it a normal where everyone in the league can do it. Staff talent cost modifier is normally set to normal. Now, these are the points that you get for playing games and stuff. If you look at the top of my screen here, you'll see it's located right beside that green F where it says 54. So you can change how often you get these points or how many you get. If you keep it all the way down the slowest, that's obviously the lowest in which you can get any type of points. And I kind of like that. Usually, if you keep it on normal, within the first year, you have pretty much all the points that you want, especially if you're not playing like all Madden, you haven't got a good slider set in there. You'll be pretty much maxed out within the year or two. And we know just that in the NFL that coaches really just don't develop like that. Most of the time, coaches, what you see is what you get, and they really don't change that much. So I like to keep mine at slowest, because you're really not going to get a lot of those points, and you'll have to be successful hitting goals every week, successful getting to the playoffs, and so on and so forth, to get a lot of those points to spin so that you can do better things like scout more players, focus scout some of your other players so they can develop quickly, re-sign certain position groups, whatever. Injury on or off, pretty self-explanatory. If you think there are way too many injuries in Madden, you can just turn it off so it doesn't happen. Pre-existing injuries mean that if you have a roster file with a player that's already hurt, so let's just say Matt Corral for the Carolina Panthers hurt his foot, has a Liz Frank injury, the latest roster update has him on the IR. Maybe I want to start a franchise with Matt Corral, not Sam Darnold or Baker Mayfield, then I can turn this off at the start of my franchise and Matt Corral won't be hurt, so no pre-existing injuries will actually count. But once you start a franchise, you can't turn it off like you see here. Practice squad stealing is exactly self-explanatory. Again, if you have players on the practice squad, the CPU can go in there and take them from you. If you want to try to develop some of those players and you don't want the CPU to do that, you can turn this off. Career clock will give you scenarios in which you can extend the career of a player depending on if they win in the playoffs or if you hit a certain goal. And sometimes that's fun. I personally like it. You can turn that off if you think it's kind of a little OP. Usually they extend the career of a player by 1 or 2 years if you continuously hit the goals. And I think it's a fun little dynamic thing to happen and kind of add a little bit of pressure to your playoff situations. And then progressive fatigue is something that was very controversial last year, which progressively makes players get tired as the season goes on. You know that you have to monitor your players' health every week in weekly strategy whenever you're practicing them. You have to make sure that you do that correctly, because if you don't, progressive fatigue is going to come in, and by the end of the season, all your players are going to be so tired that they can't play. It's a cool thing. It's dynamic. It makes it a little harder, and you have to make sure that during the weekly strategy, you monitor everybody's fatigue. I would keep that on for now. Last year, it was definitely a no-go. This year, it's good to go. Practice injury, since we're also talking about fatigue, practice injury can happen whenever you have your practice during the week. Sometimes it seems like there's always injuries that happen in practice, and in the NFL, that sometimes is the case. Again, I like to keep it on, again, just to keep it a little realistic. Most of the time, those injuries don't last more than a week, so you really don't have no big loss in doing it, but it can be kind of irritating if it's like right before a playoff game or whatever. If you don't like it, turn it off. If you do like it, obviously keep it on. Prospect storylines will give you the option of giving you a storyline throughout the year on a certain prospect. And they'll say, hey, this guy's good at maybe a certain thing. Maybe they're very smart. Maybe they're good in zone coverage. Maybe they shine this year in the NFL. Maybe you'll get storylines on, hey, this person's done this off the field, whatever. You can turn this on or off. There's no sure way of knowing if a player is actually going to be good or not. You'll just have to do your scouting, but it is kind of a more immersive thing that Madden has added that I kind of like, and I'll keep it on. Full on the field control gives you the option to obviously control every single player on the field for your team. Also super sim stuff. But if you turn this off and you're playing as a player, so let's just say I'm playing as a quarterback only, then you will only control that player. You won't have the option to move with different players. Most of the time you're going to want to keep this on, but if you do only want to control your player, then you want to keep that off. Think of it as more like a player lock type of thing for your career playthroughs. Minimum roster size is normally at 46, but we know that, or maybe it's 47, I can't really remember, but we do know that in the NFL, the roster size is 53 and that the NFL teams are always trying to keep it at 53. So for that, I make the minimum roster size 53. So you have to have 53 players. I think that is really cool to do. It makes it a little bit harder. It makes monitoring your money and your salary cap just that little harder because you've got a few extra players on your team that you have to sign, but it also gives you more depth so you don't have to scour free agency in case somebody gets hurt. In-season player movement limit is usually something that you want to implement if you're in a multi-user league. It maybe if you have, think of it as like a waiver claim for fantasy football or any fantasy sport whatsoever. You might have that one person who's constantly adding and dropping a player every week. You can add a restriction to the amount of times that they can make moves on certain players. So again, if you have somebody that's using or abusing that, that's a good thing to have. Same thing with player overall cut restrictions. You can actually put a restriction on the players that you can cut. So that means that if overall is at an 80, that means that you have a player on your team, let's say he's a quarterback, that's an 80 and you don't want him anymore. Well, you can't cut them. Again, that's just usually set so that people don't cut someone so that someone else can grab them and use them and abuse it. If you're playing it alone by yourself, I don't think it's that big of a deal. Off-season player cut limits a lot like in-season player movement. Again, it just determines how often you can cut players in multi-leagues. It says recommended setting is usually 2 players per week, but again, it's just a thing so that people don't spam cutting players, adding them, those types of things, and use and abuse it. Unfortunately, that does happen, so it might be something that you want to input into your league. Breakout scenarios are the scenarios in which your players will be able to progress from a normal development trait to star, from star to superstar, and then superstar to X Factor, which obviously gives them more XP. It also gives them certain abilities that make them stand out in the game and perform better movements and create pressure on the quarterback or make spectacular catches or throw accurate passes when under pressure, whatever. Breakout scenarios I do keep on, but if you want to make it a little bit harder, you can keep it off because the CPU does not get breakout scenarios on their side. So if you feel like that's an unfair advantage to you, then you want to keep that off. But if you do like the ability to draft a player who is a normal development trait and then eventually get into a superstar X Factor mode, then obviously you want to keep that on. Development trait regression is another huge one. I think you should keep that on at all times, and basically meaning that as a player gets older, their dev trait, which is that normal, star, superstar, and X Factor, will deteriorate as they get older. If you keep that off, that means someone like, let's just say Tom Brady, who has a superstar X Factor, he will continue to have a superstar X Factor if he plays until he's 60. And we know at some point in time, most players are not going to be the same as they are in the prime. Maybe Tom Brady's not a good example of that, but we all know of a player who was really great at a certain point and then just fell off a cliff. And because of that, and we want real NFL scenarios, we want to keep that on. And while you've got that on, you can change the desired superstar, X Factor, and star dev players for everyone in the league. So let's say you only want to have a certain amount and the lowest you can have is 25 X Factor players, then you can do that. Quarter length, again, just depends on how long you want the game to play. Do you want there to be realistic stats to the NFL? Again, for me, 12 minutes, 15-minute quarters seems to be perfect. That gives you about an hour worth of playtime, and the stats that you see at the end of the game replicate what you see on Sundays in the NFL. Accelerated play clock is on, and basically what that means is that when you start the play, instead of it starting at 30, it'll start at 15, which means that you have to read, react, you got to read the fronts, you got to get rid of the ball and hike it really quickly, and you don't get enough time. It also cuts down on how quickly or how long the game is. So if you started at 30, then that gives you an extra 15 seconds for every play in the game, and that adds up over the course of time. So with it already being at 12-minute quarters, 15-minute play clock is actually really perfect. So user team help will just determine how much help you want the CPU to give you week in and week out. I have mine on a customized experience. Normally, whenever you get this, everything's going to be manual except for manage practice reps. And we'll talk about each one of these. I recommend everything being manual. You'll get to know your team better, your players better. You'll get to know how Madden actually works. Weekly training, you can either have these on auto or manual. Obviously, that will let you choose what type of training and game planning you do for each team every week. Trades and free agency is pretty self-explanatory. Free agent bidding, injury management, preseason cut days, contract negotiations would basically mean you don't get to sign any of your players. The CPU will do it. Scout college players. That's an important thing. League advancement basically means that at the end of the draft, it'll automatically advance you into the preseason. Some people want to wait to do that and kind of look at their draft class and see what they got going on. But if you have this on auto, it'll just immediately advance you into the preseason. Then managed practice reps is the one that's on auto. And again, that was going back to what we were talking about with fatigue and progressive fatigue and all that stuff. You want to make sure that this is turned to manual. If it's on auto, you're going to leave it up to the CPU on which players practice hard during the week and which ones sit out. And again, that could come back to bite you in the butt either late in the season or in the playoffs. And the last four things, pop-ups, can't stand them, turn them off. Good thing to turn on if this is your first time playing Madden in a while, because they do give you a lot of helpful feedback. Auto progress players would mean that if you have this on, the CPU will progress your players every week when they have enough XP to spend. Auto progress their talents means that for some of those players like the Superstar X Factor and Superstar players, you can have the CPU determine what talents they get. And then fill roster would mean that if you don't reach that minimum roster limit, which we have at 53, if we go over here, then the CPU will fill it for you if you can't find anyone out. So I hope these franchise league settings help you out. If you have any questions whatsoever, make sure to leave a comment down below, or you can join the Discord and ask me there, or give me a follow over on Twitter. I'm very active there, and you can just shoot me a DM or message me there, and I'll be glad to help in any way. If you learned anything, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. I'll catch everybody later. Peace out.